We can also debug our React Native apps in VS Code. Let me show you. First, we bring up the developer menu and enable remote debugging. So this opens this window in Chrome. We have to close it, otherwise we'll get an error. But in this case, in this demo, I'm not going to close this window because I want to show you that error. Now, back to VS Code. Let's go to the extensions panel, search for React Native, and make sure you have installed this extension, React Native Tools. With this extension, we can debug React Native apps in VS Code. Now, let's go to the debug panel. The first time we have to create this file, launch.json. This is where we store our debug configurations. Currently, we don't have this file in our project, so VS Code is suggesting to create it. So click on this link. Now, from this drop-down list, select React Native. Now, sometimes VS Code doesn't show you this drop-down list. I'm not sure why, but it immediately creates the launch.json file. If this happens to you, don't worry, just continue watching. You'll figure out what to do in a second. So we select React Native. Now here we see various configurations for debugging React Native apps. These configurations are installed by that extension, React Native Tools. So if you don't install that extension, you're not going to see these configurations. Now, by default, debug Android is selected. I'm going to deselect this and select attach to packager. Honestly, this is the only configuration I'm familiar with. So we select attach to packager and click OK. And here's launch.json. So sometimes VS Code doesn't show you that drop-down list. Instead, it immediately creates this file. Now here we have various debug configurations. Currently in our configurations array, we have a single object, a single configuration. And the name of this configuration is attached to packager. If you don't have this object here, you can always add a configuration. You can either click on this button, add configuration, or you can go to the run menu and select add configuration. Now in this context menu, we search for React Native, and this brings up various configurations for debugging React Native apps. So here we have attached to packager. We also have debug Android and so on. So for example, let's select a second configuration like debug Android. So now we have a second object, a second configuration called debug Android. Now save the changes. We're done with this file. Now in case you're curious, this file is located inside this folder, .vscode. Now, let's go to app.js. I'm going to declare a variable x and set it to 1. We're going to use this during our debugging session. Now we can insert a breakpoint on this line and start our app in debug mode and execute it line by line, exactly the way we debugged our app in Chrome. Now let's go to the debug panel. In this drop-down list, we can see various debug configurations. Currently, we have two configurations, debug Android and attach to packager. I'm going to select attach to packager and click on this play button. Our debugger started and then it immediately stopped. To see why this happened, we go to the view menu and then look at debug console. So here's the error. Cannot attach to packager. Are you sure there is a packager and it is running in this port 8081? So by default, VS Code tries to connect to this packager, React Native packager, to get the JavaScript code on this port 8081. We have to change this port to this port over here, 19001. So back to VS Code. On the top, we go to the code menu, then preferences, settings. Now under user tab, here we search for react-native.packager.port. So look, here's the port 8081. We have to change this to 19001. Now we're done with this. Let's bring up the debug panel one more time and start our app in debug mode. Our debugger failed one more time. So let's go to view, debug console. Here's the second error. Could not debug. Another debugger is already connected to packager. This happened because we have this window open in the background. So sometimes you have a million tabs or windows open. You don't know that you have this window open somewhere. That's why nothing works on your machine. So make sure to find this window and close it because you can either debug in Chrome or VS Code at a single point in time. not both these processes. So now we're going to debug in VS Code, which means our JavaScript code is going to get executed inside VS Code. So let's bring up the debug panel one more time and start our app. All right, we established a connection. Beautiful. So here's our simulator. Now let's bring up the developer menu and reload the app. So the debugger loaded. Now let me close the debug console. Take a look. We are in app.js, and the first line where I inserted a breakpoint is highlighted. So now we can execute our code line by line. We have the same tools that we had in Chrome. We can step over the current line. We can step into it if you're calling a function that we have written. If you're inside a function, we can step out of it. We can restart our debugger, and we can disconnect from our debugging session. So let's step over this line. And by the way, the shortcut is F10. Now here on the left side, we can see the value of various variables. So VS Code automatically detected the variables in scope. So here we have X, the value of X is 1. We also have our watch window. So we can selectively watch various variables in case they're not detected over here. So we can type X and we can see the value of X. So now we can execute our code line by line and see what's going on. When we are done, we should always stop the debugging session because our JavaScript code is executed remotely inside VS Code. So we disconnect here. Then we go to our app, bring up the developer menu, and stop remote debugging. Now we get this error, runtime is not ready for debugging. Don't worry about this. We just need to reload our app. And here you can find the shortcut for reloading. On Mac, it's Command and R. So now our app is running just like before, and the debugging session is terminated.